So my name is Miguel. I'm gonna be moderating this stand-up meeting or this panel. And the way it's gonna work is I'm gonna kick it off with a couple of questions, and after that I'll give the mic to you, or you ask the question, I will repeat it. And yes, we got 30 minutes. We are 10 people, so I'm not expecting everybody to answer the same question. Actually, I'm expecting you to fight for answering a question, so like a little Hunger Game kind of thing. Not really, I mean, I'm gonna limit it to 2 answers per question, or 3. And what we're gonna do to start is I'm gonna ask you to introduce yourself like very, very quickly, like 2 sentences, please.
Howdy, I'm Vic. I work on Kubernetes charts, probably not reviewing your PRs fast enough. I started with the testing aspect of charts and making sure that we had some stability there, and looking forward to the next generation or the next path forward with charts.
I'm Lucky, work on charts as well.
I'm Matt, one of the 3 Matts. I work on charts and Helm. With charts, I've been interested in CI systems like Vic has, and yeah.
I'm Reinhard. I'm a charts maintainer. Did a couple of PRs on Helm as well. Yeah.
Adam, core maintainer, and I provide the witty humor.
I'm Taylor. You're probably tired of hearing me.
I'm Technosophos Matt Butcher. I provide the not witty humor.
Justin, I try to provide the humor.
I'm Matt Fisher. I'm number 3 of the Matts, so.
Hi, I'm Nikhil, Slicknick on the Slack channel and pretty much everywhere working on Helm.
Michelle, Helm core maintainer.
Okay, so just keep the mic there. First question, very easy. What has surprised you since you started the Helm project, or since you started contributing to it?
I started contributing mostly at the beginning, so everything surprises me. I think the number of people who have gotten involved, I think like people were like building their own kind of Helm and then decided to like not do that and contribute to this project. So it's been really great to see lots of different perspectives in the baking themselves in the tool from different companies. So yeah.
On that side, Adam?
One of the things that surprised me was the first time in Slack when I saw someone answering another person's question that wasn't on the core team. And that to me was just the start of the community and people helping each other. So.
Matt Butcher?
This has been surprising for me. I really appreciate everybody coming out to do this. This has been a lot of fun. I can't tell you what it's like to look out and see and hear all your stories.
Okay, so second question. Packaging applications is not the most exciting thing in the world, but still, I mean, I work packaging applications, so, but still, you know, we got more than 4,000 stars in GitHub. It's a de facto package manager in Kubernetes. What do you think that has contributed to this success, to the success of this project? Matt Farina, for example?
So what do I think has contributed? The core team's ability to listen to people like you, to not just try to solve a problem with what they think, but to go out and ask and listen to user stories and talk to people and hear what problems need to be solved. Because you're right, it isn't exciting, but by making it boring, it also should just work. And they've put a lot into just trying to make it work consistently without breaking and listen to people along the way.
Actually, I think another thing that's kind of like really contributed to that has been having being really strict on our semantic versioning for everything that we've been trying to do. We've been trying to make sure that every release does not break backwards compatible, or does not make backwards incompatible changes to people's workflows. And for better or for worse, that has made things that have evolved and changed in the ecosystem a little bit harder, and it seems like there's a couple of things that can be changed. But for the most part, people who have been using Helm 2, all the way from Helm 2.0.0-alpha 1, all the way until version 2.8.1, which is the latest release, the workflow of Helm init and Helm install your package has been basically the exact same thing since the very beginning. And I think that's been very interesting.
You're going to get all three Matts to weigh in on the exact same issue. I happen to think that package management has played a very crucial formative role in most of the open source ecosystems. To me, when I watched Linux sort of come of age, because I'm that old, distributions grew out of how easy and how good the respective package management systems worked. So if you look back to Red Hat and the rise of the Ubuntu ecosystem, which came out of Debian, and the way that they built communities around package management and the conventions that came out of it, that to me, it was sort of the first taste of the fact that if we can solve this problem in a good way, then we can build, we can lay down that foundational layer and start layering bigger, better, more important things on top of it. And then you see the same thing in programming language ecosystems, right? A lot of the languages like JavaScript were relegated to a very specific set of adding quaint little knobs and switches on websites until someone went, wait, we can start doing libraries, and then we can start doing management on top of those. And then you saw the explosion of the kind of JavaScript eating the world kind of environment. So to me, I think package management is really one of the most exciting ecosystems to be part of, because you are solving something that's a general usability problem, but that is enabling a whole bunch of people to build stuff that you just kind of sit back in awe and say, wow, I played a tiny piece in the foundation of that, and they did something great on top of it.
Anybody else? No? So Matt, you actually mentioned before in your keynote that you have been working on open source projects before, and I would like to ask you and any others, like, what will be the main advice that you will give to anybody that wants to start an open source project, or the most valuable advice that you will give?
The most valuable advice. You guys can judge whether anything I say is valuable, but I'll try. Yeah, I mean, the most interesting thing to me has been that you can run a relatively successful open source project in particular niches without building much of a community. But I'll be honest, it wasn't all that rewarding. Matt Farina and I wrote an HTML parser. And this parser is used very, very broadly. We have millions of downloads of this thing and no community whatsoever. So it's kind of cool, right? But ultimately, it feels like something we did in the past and was interesting and all of that. When you're engaged fully with the community, it changes the way that the whole trajectory of the project goes. And I don't know if there are any secrets to doing that. I kind of feel like we sort of stumbled into something. But if you can do that, the sense of fulfillment that comes out of it, I think, is much higher than doing a project that you do in isolation that happens to have an open source license and be somewhere on GitHub.
Okay.
Such a cliche thing, but kindness and empathy go far away, a long way. And especially in open source, when we don't get to see each other like this all the time, and not everybody has the luxury of flying in and getting a hotel and coming to an event like this. I think being extra kind and nice, on GitHub and in the issue queue and in Slack, goes a long way. And also, this is something that I've learned because this is my first open source project that I've maintained. And what I learned just by observing is being able to admit when you don't know something also goes a long way. Nobody knows all the answers, and if they do, you should really stop listening to them because they're just being arrogant, and you should be skeptical of those things. But it's way better to be hey, I don't really know the answer to this. Even as a maintainer on the project, maybe I don't know, and that goes a long way because then you encourage another person to take ownership of that problem and then contribute, and that's something that has surprised me and something I've learned a lot from.
Okay.
Yeah, or just driving on that home on that fact, just being able to see other people who have been there's this idea out there that sounds kind of interesting, but I'd really be interested in hearing your feedback on that. I think I used to do that quite a bit when I first started working on open source, was I'd be like, okay, there's this problem. I'm going to go and solve it today, and this is how I'm going to do and implement it. But thinking back from it, I think it would have been a lot better going into those problem topics and saying, is there any ideas that other people have thought about, or is there any parallel, or going around and talking and asking people, like, is there any parallel problems that other people have been seeing in other ecosystems? And coming up with a solution either with others in tandem to be able to figure out that solution together, or saying that I simply don't know the problem, and figuring out where is the right person or who's the right people to come around and ask for that exact solution if they know it. So,
one of the things that I've learned through the charts process is that people are going to come and go from your open source project, so you have to be ready to kind of take on that weight or figure out how to bring on new contributors. And that's been something that's been a challenge on charts, because people can kind of do flyby contributions and just be like, hey, I made a chart, boom, here you go. And then by the time you get to review it, they're gone. So figuring out how to deal with the community and even maintainers' churn is something that I think we're still learning about. And Matt Farina is really helping with kind of getting us ready for fluid maintainership, as I'd like to call it.
So what are the bigger challenges that the Helm project is facing right now? This is my last question, by the way, and the most difficult one.
I can speak for charts specifically, and when we started, it was very much like, let's show that Kubernetes can run various workloads. So we started with 7 charts. There was a database, a caching thing, some applications like Nginx, and then it exploded from there with everybody's application that had ever run in Kubernetes being contributed. So now we have the challenge of figuring out how to continue to maintain with no dedicated people on the maintainership of charts, and figure out what it looks like to delegate back control to the users and the community around individual charts. So that's something we've started with the owner's files, and something that Matt's been driving with just giving people as much control as possible through GitHub. And maybe there are better ideas like Tamal's idea of different ways to package and different ways to vendor in various charts.
From the Helm side of things, I would say that it's really just finding the proper balance and points of abstraction. Just as a developer, I know that's one of the things that we worry about, and that we kind of saw in these proposals, is everybody does things slightly different, generally for good reasons, with how they deploy their environment, deploy their applications, and how they use it. And so it's finding those right points about where we provide the value and the features that the community needs without painting ourselves into a corner. And so for me, that's one of the biggest difficulties I see, especially as we're coming into this Helm 3 cycle, is doing that correctly, so that we enable all of you who've contributed and have really used Helm and made it what it is without making it something that's just impossible to extend or work from.
One difficult thing, at least for me working on this, has been saying no to people. People have their specific use case and see a feature as very valuable and want to contribute it. But having clear boundaries as far as what the project is and isn't is critical to make sure that it doesn't become muddy for everybody. And when somebody puts a lot of effort in to a PR or writing a proposal or something like that, that's completely out of scope. It is very hard to deliver the bad news of, this isn't quite the direction we want to go, because you don't want to cut off contributions. That's what open source is. We want the contributions coming in, but to be able to communicate that and make it clear that, look, we still value this. We think it's awesome, but it's just not a core feature that we want to implement. That was something that I have really struggled with and still do.
Hey, for me, on Helm, it's sort of been a battle with upstream Kubernetes moving as fast as they do, and us always trying to be sort of backwards compatible, make sure things from the package management sides, things don't break. And I think there's an inherent tension there, and we're walking a fine line, and that tends to be really hard. So,
from the chart side, any challenge? Like, I don't know, you mentioned some, but
I think one thing, also reinforcing a little bit on what Adam was saying about scope, was simply documentation. Not just like documentation, but coming up with, there's a ton of activity and buzz that's happening. Oh, oops. Hello? There we go. I think there's a lot of, hello! There's a lot of activity and buzz happening in, like, say, the Helm users and the Helm dev channel, that a lot of questions are being asked and a lot of questions are being answered, which I think is fantastic. But what I'm seeing a lot is either a lot of people are coming to the Helm users or the Helm dev channels and they're asking more or less the same questions. Or they're asking like they're coming with a new question, but it comes up ending up being the same answer at the end of it, or it looks from a different perspective. I would really like to see, so like for the scope as well, I'd really like to kind of like define a use case or being able to capture these questions and answers that are coming inbound from people who are asking on like Slack or on Helm users or whatnot, and being able to come up with those answers. And I think the Kubernetes group did this really, really well early on, where they started putting these and asking them to be put in Stack Overflow. So a lot of people will come to these questions and they'd have an answer to be able to look up on the tags and whatnot. I would be really interested to see how we could make it easier for people to come out and say, I have a question, but how do I see those use cases and how do I see how other people have answered that question? Or has someone else had this problem before me? And I think asynchronous chat can sometimes not be the right forum for having these questions all the time.
Lucky, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just challenges with being a chart maintainer. So one of our jobs is to give you best practices and curated versions of Kubernetes applications. What does that actually mean? And when you dig into it, it's actually extremely complicated to keep up. We started, 1.3, and now to 1.8, 1.9. These are getting very complex definitions and how they're managed. And there's a massive gap from what's in the docs. You get little snippets, but actually tying them all together into a complex application. I see a lot of folks ending up at Helm Charts or the upstream charts repo to get a definition of what best practices looks like when you tie all these features together. And we only had several resource APIs in earlier versions. Now we have, I think Brian mentioned how many, 600? 60, okay, factor of 10 off. Yeah. Well, next year we'll be at 600, but just different resource and workloads and pod disruption budgets. So people are looking to these charts to actually show visible implementations of how you might use this in a very complicated way. So we feel the burden of that responsibility as maintainers, that as these features come out, to roll them into charts to give the community a really tangible description of how you might want to use that. Now that is great, but it's actually really complex to keep up. Question?
Not all of the charts there are the same quality because of just how they were developed. Could you bless a few, say, here's some shining examples so that people can go look?
Yeah, so the question was, could we bless some of the charts as use cases for all the rest? Did you want to take that? I think we want to do that, and kind of the way we've set up CI is around charts that are heavily used and maintained. But Matt, do you have something to add?
Sure. So what are the best practices that should be in those charts? And that's one of the questions we're struggling with right now, to ask those questions. And we've started to try to gather those based on our experiences, based on experiences that you've all had and described. And so we're trying to put that together right now so we can actually say, what are the best practices? And then we can start to craft more charts to do that and get it into a good state. And then I think at that point, we'll be able to say, this chart and this chart and this chart are good examples for you to look at because we've been able to craft them there. But we're kind of at the stage of asking, what are those practices we want? And what we're finding is, as we're asking them, they're actually evolving and changing to deal with some of the complexities. Go back a few versions and look at how we handled RBAC versus how we handle that today. And how will we handle that 6 months from now? It's kind of in a changing state. And so we're trying to do that, but it's not as simple as it seems on the surface.
But until you figure it out, pick a few and just say, this is the best we know today.
So how many people have used Helm Create? Okay, so that should be the shining example, right? That should be the perfect implementation of a very trivial application with all of the things. Network policy, RBAC enabled, ingress in there. And so if you want to make a contribution towards best practices, that's where we've tried to put kind of the scaffolded out best practice for something simple, and then you can move from there. So I think that's something that we should do, and maybe adding more starter templates to Helm core could help us kind of not necessarily pin it to an application, right? But say, here is something trivial as far as what it actually does, but it shows all of the patterns.
Question there.
So if Chart Museum had a rating mechanism,
Yeah,
Repeat the question.
So if Chart Museum had a rating mechanism, was the comment. And the thing I'll say to that is, so Bitnami has kubeapps, and they've got hub.kubeapps.com. It was built on Monocular, and they've taken it further than that. One of the things that they recently added was a rating mechanism. And all of the stable and incubator charts from the public repository are listed in it. So there sort of is something that the community has created today that you could use.
no, could we collect that data and then feed it back into the chart that you have available?
So the question though is, so what does it mean though for that to be rated, right? Is it because the application is interesting to people? You know, Nginx Ingress right now I think is probably our most popular chart. I don't know that it's the best built chart yet, but it's the most popular.
Well, Movie Score has what the people think,
Right.
what the critics think.
Another
I
question.
could add
back
my
there.
2 cents. Yeah.
Back there.
Yeah, no pressure. Ratings are great, but there's a whole class of metadata that would be interesting. We should make a more open approach to being able to distribute and share that metadata. And I didn't catch the example. Grapheus?
Grapheus.
Okay,
Okay.
open API for Grapheus. Aaron Krickenberg.
Oh, wait.
Berger.
So we've actually talked about, we do collect a little bit of metadata on the charts that are downloaded and some of those details, but it's really hard to distinguish some of that right now, such as, is it from our own CI system? Is it Helm? Is it Monocular, kubeapps? What's pulling it, and how is that being used? And we found that a lot of the data was actually pretty not usable because of that. And so we've been working over time to add things like user agents into things, so eventually our data can get into a better place. We also, since we do stick it in a bucket, it's all coming from a bucket and it ends up in big table and all of this stuff. We've got to look at how do we make that data available once it's in better shape. But our first problem was actually how do we get it to be in good shape? And then once it's in good shape, we'll look at how do we display that with the public. But that is one of the things that we want to do. We want to try and automate some of that.
This sounds like a great working group / SIGAPS working group. 9 a.m. PST Mondays on Zoom.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was curious what you as maintainers view as the pros and cons of having joined the Kubernetes project, and if you had it to do over again, would you make that decision today?
So I'll repeat it. He asked, what do the maintainers see as the pros and cons of joining the Kubernetes project? And if you had to do it over again, would you do it again today? And with that, I'll pass it off.
Okay, I'll take this one because as I'm very heavily involved in Helm and I do a lot with Kubernetes, but I actually haven't been involved a lot with Kubernetes community except for being involved in the channels inside of Kubernetes. And so I'll do that as like the background for where I come from. Now, I think that it is good that we are part of the Kubernetes community as the Kubernetes org as it stands now. I think in an ideal world with all of these things, a lot of this stuff wouldn't fall under necessarily Kubernetes org. All these other side projects wouldn't necessarily be part of a Kubernetes org. But because of that right now, it's a good place for us because so many people are using it, and it allows us to do some of the things like what Matt showed yesterday with testing against the tip of Kubernetes and kind of being involved with that and being a good driving engine for change inside of Kubernetes. So I do think we fit there. I personally think the future would be that a lot of these other side projects don't necessarily all sit inside of the Kubernetes org. This is just my opinion, but I really do think that would be the future because there's different ways that each of these projects might operate, and not just Helm. There's tons of others that are under the Kubernetes umbrella that might fit outside of it. But if I were to do it again where we are now, I'd say yes, we should be part of the Kubernetes org. But if it evolves like I think it might evolve and how I think it should evolve, I would say that we would want to do our own thing. That's how I would answer it.
We have time for one more question, I think.
What are the things that in charts that you would like to see if someone built like a linter that check automatically for things in charts? What would be the things you would look for?
So let me repeat that. What are the things you would look for in a linter, if somebody built a linter to build a chart, for linting a chart? So Reinhard here is the most epic PR reviewer of all time on charts. He is actually like amazing, and sometimes I like review something, and then he'll come through and find like 7 other things that should change, and I'm like, oh yeah, that too. But he has a really good kind of approach to doing these things, and so he also contributes to Helm Create and what that main template is. But we have the best practices, and he's always pointing back to the best practices doc. So whatever is in there, if we can add a linter or a check for those things, I think that would be great. And I'll hand it off to Reinhard for his opinion.
Thanks, Vic. And with that, I would like to get back to your question, maybe like as far as identifying blessed charts. I think that would really be important, but the question is, how do we identify a blessed chart? I mean, I think there's always this gap between like a good chart in terms of our best practices and a good chart from the point of the application that's installed. And we as chart maintainers are rather experts on how do you like develop a chart, but we're not necessarily application experts for the specific chart. So the question is, how do we identify a blessed chart? It might be a perfect chart from our point of view, but it might crash when you install it. It won't crash because we test it, but we never know how good is it really. That's the problem. So we can really more or less only put our focus on trying to apply our best practices, improve Helm init, as he said. There's still some things missing. There's no RBAC in yet, no network policies. We're working on network policies currently. How can we do this? There are a few proposals out there. And yeah, we're just trying to make things better. And and I'm really putting focus on best practices. This is why I'm picking on that in the PR. Sorry, guys. But I really try and help and make things better. And we really try to we're a repository of curated charts, more or less, and not something like yesterday we had the wheelhouse, which is certainly a great idea, which certainly has its place. I think both things have their place. So we, as really a curated repository in something else where people can just push their stuff at. So it depends on what you need and what you want.
So one thing that we've tried to do with charts reviews is always have a document that says why we're not going to accept or why we want you to change something. Can't just arbitrarily come up and say, yeah, you should change this because I decided so. So we try to add to those best practices docs, and then as a second pass, try to get those automated as much as possible. So that's kind of the flow that we're trying to go for.
And I guess I'll come back to the original question of how do you get that into the linter? My response would be ask him his opinion a lot, bug him when you get an answer, a pull request against the linter to add that functionality to scan for it. That's the thing. And then turn it into a bot because that'll help us on the charts repo. But that's kind of my approach.
Or you could build your own chart linter plugin if you want. GitHub.com/Helm/Kubernetes/Helm/docs/plugins.md.
Okay, so we ran out of time. I just want to thank you, all of you, and just give it up for the team.